So as we've discussed in previous videos, the engine control unit and all of the other ECUs on the vehicles can work together to be able to provide us a safe and secure starting of an engine and a moving off of a vehicle, as well as a start-stop function. The last function that I want to talk about is our remote start. Now, if you haven't picked it already, there is a vehicle parked right up on top of that hill. It's just there. Now, if you were to be, I don't know, having a picnic for some bizarre reason, a long way away from the car, you may want to start up that vehicle so that by the time you get there, it's going to be nice and warm and toasty. Or if it's in the middle of summer, you may want to have it so that the air conditioning's been running for a few minutes to have cooled the vehicle down before you can get into it. And particularly if you're in Australia, so that you can actually touch the steering wheel when you get into it. Now, this might seem like a first world problem, wanting your vehicle to be hotter or colder by the time you get to it, and being able to start that vehicle up without being in it. However, there are some real genuine reasons why we would want this to happen. Let's take, for example, if you're on a work site. Let's imagine, for example, that you have a generator that's providing power for tools or for some test equipment that you use. And let's say, for example, that vehicle is on the top of a hill. And just in case you're wondering where it is, there it is. And let's imagine for a while that similar to the last scenario, you're working down here. So you obviously don't want to go traipsing all the way back to your vehicle to turn the generator on, to walk all the way back, and only to use the tool for 2 minutes to walk all the way back and turn it off. You know, it may be that you can't drive over there, so you have to walk. And it would be really good to have a remote start to be able to do that operation for you. So there are some real good real-life commercial applications for this. Remote starts can be used on all sorts of vehicles, generators, air compressors, mining equipment, agricultural equipment, cars. There's a whole heap of a whole range of reasons why you would want to have this fitted. So the good news is we really don't have to build a lot more into this. Once you have your ECUs and all the sensors to go with it that you need to be able to do a certain function, all you have to do is just program the ECU so that the ECU can do what you want it to do. So in this case, with the remote start, you already have a security control unit which can communicate to your key. So when you push the key buttons in a certain sequence, or if you push and hold a key button, then the security control unit can recognize that and then communicate out via the CAN bus to the engine ECU to say, hey, can you start? The engine ECU will then communicate out to the other ECUs. For example, it will communicate to the transmission ECU to say, hey, are you in gear? Because we don't want to remote start a vehicle if the vehicle's in gear. Hopefully the communication will come back to the engine ECU to say, hey, no, it's all good. It may also communicate to the vehicle control unit just to make sure that nobody's holding the button, because it wouldn't want to remote start if there was somebody in the vehicle. So it can check sensors just to see if there's anybody or any occupants within the vehicle already. It will also then communicate or possibly communicate out to the ABS control unit, make sure the vehicle's not moving, and then those same units will then report back via the CAN bus to the engine control unit. If all the messages at the engine control unit come back as okay based upon its programming, then it will then operate the relay to start the engine. Now, built within the engine control unit, it may then have a timer system built in that may be programmable, so that when you actually come to when you actually have started it, it will only run for a certain period of time. Now, part of that is a protection to make sure that the vehicle isn't going to start and then run all day and all night. Some of that might be because it might be starting in a confined area, so you don't want it to be able to cause any injury to anybody. There's a variety of different reasons why you may have a certain timing to it. But once it's figured it out, you know, once it comes to the end and it turns itself off, That's all good. Now, this shouldn't be confused. The remote start shouldn't necessarily be confused with some of the remote starts you have on other vehicles. For example, on some heavy vehicles, it has a remote start function, and that definition is that you can program a certain amount of features to it. For example, if the air temperature inside the cabin got too cold, it could start the engine to heat it up. If the batteries were getting low on charge, so if you're sleeping in your truck, if the batteries get low on charge while you're watching the TV, then it can automatically start the truck to build up the battery levels. You can set it also to start the engine if your diesel fuel was getting too cold, and that's really important when you start getting into some of those places with snowy seasons where the fuel can get too cold. So they use a remote start, not so much a remote start from the button. They define a remote start and sometimes a remote start stop in terms of a function that it can do without necessarily the driver being present. So a couple of different ways it can function. Even then, it's still using this, it's still doing the same process as you do with a remote start from a key fob, and that is it will then check via the security unit, the transmission unit, vehicle control, etc., etc. It will then talk to all of those to decide whether it can start the engine or not. So none of this is a guarantee. Now, the good thing about remote starts, even if it is a bit of a first world problem initially, having said that, as I explained, it has commercial problems. There are some other problems that we can come across, and it's something like this. If we had this scenario, it would be really great that rather than having to do this, we could actually start the vehicle up without getting into it. You know, when the door rubbers have actually, or the door seals have managed to freeze against the door frames and you can't get the doors open, that's a really great function to be able to start the vehicle up and to actually get it nice and warm so that it will melt the ice that's holding it all together. So there you go, that is the remote start stop. That is the last of the features that we have on our starting systems. Now, there are other starting features and starting systems out there. As I said, this is a generic look through. There are going to be different functions, different ECUs, different names for things. Even between the start stop functions, you are going to find that there are different start stop different names for those start stop functions, even if it's what we call it start stop as a generic, and that's just part of the automotive life. So answer the questions in your workbook, answer the questions that you have online before moving on to the next section.